You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 382, Yellow Fever in Philadelphia. Now, last week, we covered the arrival of Citizen Genêt, France's new ambassador to the U.S. His mission was to weaken the enemy coalition against France by forcing them to divert resources to a war in America. The Washington administration was trying to avoid being dragged into a new war, but it felt powerless as Genêt seemed to have popular support in rousing volunteers in the cause of liberty. Although Genêt had only arrived in April 1793, he already had privateers using American ports by May and bringing British prizes into American ports. The British minister in Philadelphia, George Hammond, was flooding the administration with protests and threatening war. French privateers needed to be barred from U.S. ports, and captured British ships returned to their owners. President Washington wasn't sure how to stop this. In June, he denounced the French for bringing prize ships into U.S. ports. Genêt simply ignored this and continued converting privateers in U.S. ports. When Jefferson tried to get Genêt to tone down his efforts, Genêt accused Jefferson of failing to support the cause of republicanism over monarchy. Washington left town in late June, returning to Mount Vernon, after receiving the news of the death of one of the key people who oversaw his plantations. He left his cabinet and Pennsylvania officials to deal with the crisis. In July, the Attorney General prosecuted 2 Americans in Philadelphia who had served aboard a French privateer that had been commissioned in Charleston. There wasn't any law against serving on a French privateer, so Randolph simply charged them with disturbing the peace. Genêt hired a defense attorney for the men, and a jury acquitted them. The fighting came to a head over a converted privateer named La Petite Démocrate, which had been outfitted in Philadelphia and was prepared to sail. Hamilton proposed arming the fort on Mud Island in the Delaware River and just blowing the ship out of the water if it attempted to leave Philadelphia. Jefferson rejected this idea, believing that doing that would start a war with France. Letting it go, though, would likely mean a war with Britain. Washington returned in mid-July. When he met with his cabinet, even Jefferson admitted that Genêt was out of control and a danger to the United States. Before any action could be taken, La Petite Démocrate left port on July 14th and began attacking British merchant vessels. Hamilton demanded that Washington ask France to recall Genêt. Jefferson confessed to others that he feared the U.S. would end up going to war with France in order to avoid war with Britain. All communications between the administration and Genêt were met with haughty dismissals. Genêt made clear that he didn't care what the administration thought. The people of America supported the cause of liberty, and he would continue with his actions. The administration better either get on board or be left behind. Washington delayed any action, asking the Supreme Court to weigh in on the matter. Chief Justice John Jay sent back a reply, said the court could not do anything because they all left town in August for reasons that we'll get into in a moment. A few weeks later, Washington finally agreed to request Genêt's recall, although he went with Jefferson's polite recall request rather than Hamilton's more belligerent wording. Jefferson sent the request on August 23rd, but we all knew that it would take months for it to reach France and to receive a response. Hamilton began publishing a series of anonymous articles objecting to Genêt's actions and accusing him of trying to involve the U.S. in a war that it did not want. In August, though, a new problem arose that pushed aside this growing diplomatic issue. On August 5th, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a prominent physician and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, received a call from Dr. Hugh Hodge to come over to his house. Hodge's young daughter was jaundiced, suffering from a high fever, and vomiting blood. She died that day. Over the next 2 weeks, Rush saw many more patients with the same symptoms, several of whom also died. By August 23rd, Elizabeth Drinker noted that she was aware of 70 people who had already become sick or had died. By that time, there were about 20 deaths per day in Philadelphia. Philadelphians began getting sick in overwhelming numbers, which seemed to grow exponentially. Victims would get a fever and headache. Eventually, they would begin vomiting blood, while their eyes became jaundiced and their skin took on a yellowish tint. Yellow fever had struck the city. Over the next 2 months, around 11,000 people would contract the disease, and half of those would die. The deaths constituted about 10% of the city's population. Everyone knew the disease was spreading like crazy, but no one understood the cause. Some believed it was unsanitary conditions in the city. Dr. Rush believed it was a tropical disease brought by a ship from the West Indies. No one knew its origin. All they knew was that hundreds, maybe even thousands of people were dying from it. The result was a general panic. On August 29th, the mayor convened all the leading physicians in the city, and they could come up with nothing. They mostly suggested keeping the streets clear, and anyone who could should simply leave Philadelphia. Nearly half the city's population fled over the next few weeks, including pretty much all the federal government. Congress wasn't in session anyway during the summer, but the Supreme Court was. The justices fled town in early August, just as the epidemic began. President Washington initially tried to maintain calm by remaining in his home at the presidential mansion. On September 5th, Alexander Hamilton and his wife Eliza both became ill. Several days later, at Martha's urging, Washington finally packed up and took his family back to Mount Vernon. Secretary of War Henry Knox initially stepped in to deal with any matters of government. Vice President Adams was already away at home in Quincy, Massachusetts, where he spent most of the year anyway. Jefferson, who had initially seemed unconcerned and actually accused Hamilton of being a hypochondriac when he first complained of symptoms, also remained at his post at the State Department until he realized that his entire department was gone except for a single clerk. Everyone else had either gotten sick or fled the city. So Jefferson also packed up and returned to Monticello. Hamilton also left the city while still sick. He traveled to New York City, where officials tried to put him under quarantine. Instead, he left for Albany, where his father-in-law lived. There, the locals treated him like a leper, trying to keep their distance and fearing that he and his wife would spread the disease through that city. They were eventually permitted to stay in the Schuyler Mansion, but that everyone in that mansion was then under lockdown and not permitted to go out in public. Rumors that Hamilton had died spread through New England, causing panics in the financial markets until the rumors were proven false. Meanwhile, things only got worse in Philadelphia. By mid-September, deaths had risen to over 100 per day. Doctors were prescribing anything from cold baths to mercurial purges to bloodletting. Others suggested that smoking or taking vinegar might ward off the disease, but nothing really seemed to work. Cartmen waited in front of the city hall for pickups of bodies. The city banned the tolling of bells for the dead since it became too common an occurrence. Families isolated themselves. If a family member got sick, they were often tossed out into the street to avoid infecting the rest of the family. Nearly 20,000 people fled the city, heading out to the country or to other towns. Several New York mobs prevented refugees from Philadelphia from entering the city. Dr. Rush remained in Philadelphia, treating more than 100 patients per day. Unfortunately, his treatments, which included excessive bleeding, probably did more harm than help. Rush also turned to the black community, believing that they were immune from the disease. Black volunteers stepped up to help nurse patients and help with other duties. Rush taught several black men how to bleed patients. Of course, black people were not immune, and hundreds of them also got sick and died. The post office ceased to function. Ships' cargoes rotted on the pier with no one to unload them. Schools closed, newspapers closed. The city essentially shut down. With everyone focused on the epidemic, side issues like the potential war with Europe tended to fall to the side. Citizen Genêt, however, tried to remain on mission. The French ambassador fled Philadelphia in August when the outbreak first began. He arrived in New York on August 7th, prepared to raise an army. Crowds greeted him with chants of "Genêt to power" and "Down with Washington." And not all the cheers were coming from New Yorkers. A French fleet that included about 5,000 soldiers and sailors had arrived in New York for repairs and resupply. Once ready, Genêt planned to break this naval fleet into 3 squadrons. One was going to attack the British at Halifax. A second squadron would coordinate an invasion of Spanish St. Augustine, and a third would head for Spanish New Orleans. These French fleets would coordinate with their American volunteer armies that Genêt had already begun to raise. One of the ships that had put in for repair was l'Embuscade. This was the same ship that brought Genêt to America back in April. At the end of July, a British frigate, the Boston, had sailed down from New York disguised as a French ship of war. The Boston used its false French identity to capture another French ship that sent one of the captured officers to New York to inform l'Embuscade that it wanted to do battle. So the French frigate sailed out to attack. On July 31st, the two ships fought a protracted battle. After several hours, l'Embuscade seemed to get the better of the fight, knocking out several of the Boston's masts. Late in the day, a French cannonball took out both the British captain and the head of Marines on board. By evening, the surviving British officers decided to withdraw the ship. The l'Embuscade pursued but couldn't catch them, and the Boston returned to Halifax, while l'Embuscade returned to New York. The whole naval battle took place about 15 miles off the coast of Sandy Hook, New Jersey, so hundreds of Americans flocked to the shore to watch the battle. After Genêt arrived the following week, New Yorkers seemed excited at the prospect of war with Britain. When Genêt arrived in New York, he seemed at the height of his popularity. While the American government was unable to coordinate anything due to the flight of officials escaping yellow fever in Philadelphia, Genêt seemed to think that Americans were ready to follow him into war and just dump the Washington administration. He issued $100,000 worth of drafts to begin the construction of several French naval vessels in New York. The Federalists in New York attacked Genêt for his disrespect of President Washington. Chief Justice John Jay, who had left Philadelphia for his home in New York, along with Senator Rufus King, published an article based on information from Hamilton, revealing Genêt's confrontational attitude and his refusal to respect presidential authority. Genêt denied the public charges and even tried to bring a libel suit against Jay and King. Across the country, Americans were divided. I mentioned Hamilton was publishing editorials against Genêt. James Monroe began a similar series of articles in favor of supporting France. The Federalists tended to characterize the issue as a French official bullying our president. The Democratic Republicans appealed to the need to support liberty and the Republic of France against the forces of monarchy. But even many Democratic Republicans seemed ready to overthrow President Washington to further that cause of liberty. As the summer came to an end, so did Genêt's plans for war in America. His main obstacle had not been political. Genêt found great support among the Democratic Republicans of New York. Governor George Clinton embraced Genêt and supported his efforts. Genêt even began dating the governor's daughter, Cornelia Clinton. What really seemed to slow up Genêt's progress was that yellow fever epidemic. Although the disease remained largely confined to Philadelphia, some cases did begin to turn up in New York, and many New Yorkers fled the city. The same happened in most large cities across the country. People feared that Philadelphia was only the beginning and got out of town where they could be safe. This made it impossible to recruit armies in the time frame that they would have for any sort of fighting season before winter. Work stopped on Genêt's shipbuilding, and the drafts that he had provided proved worthless after Hamilton's Department of Treasury refused to release to him the American debt payments to France. The French soldiers and sailors who had arrived with the fleet from the West Indies and who were now in New York learned that they were going to be sent back south rather than home to France, so many of the sailors mutinied. When Genêt ordered the soldiers to disarm the soldiers marched to the ships, joined the sailors, and the whole group marched back together to Genêt's house, which they burned to the ground. The Federalist argument that Genêt was challenging President Washington and meant to bring down the federal government caught hold with most Americans as popular opinion turned against Genêt. By October, Washington, still at Mount Vernon, was looking for ways to get his government back to work. In September, he had laid the cornerstone for the new U.S. Capitol in D.C., but it would still be years before the new Capitol was ready to house the government. Congress did not plan to meet until December, but Washington wanted to call a special session. He asked others if they thought he could call a special session somewhere other than Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson, who stopped by Mount Vernon on his way back to Pennsylvania, said he did not think calling Congress into session somewhere other than the Capitol would be constitutional. Remember, one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence was that the governor, especially in Massachusetts, was moving legislative sessions to other places that the colonists found inconvenient. Washington also reached out for Hamilton's opinion. Hamilton, who by this time had recovered from the yellow fever, responded that the president could request that Congress meet somewhere else, but he couldn't order it. Washington decided that he would return to Pennsylvania, asking his cabinet members to join him in Germantown, a smaller village only a few miles from Philadelphia, but it did not seem to be suffering from the deadly disease. On October 28th, he left Mount Vernon. He actually caught up with Jefferson, who had only made it as far as Baltimore, and the men traveled together to Germantown, where they arrived on November 1st. The small town could barely house the cabinet, let alone Congress. After a few weeks in Germantown, though, it became clear that the epidemic in Philadelphia was over. While the contemporaries never figured out the cause of it, we know today that yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes. So when the first frosts hit the region, the mosquitoes died and the new infections ceased. It took a few weeks for everyone to be certain, but by December, Washington returned to Philadelphia, and Congress met at the time and place it had originally planned way back in March. Washington gave his fifth State of the Union address, where he defended his position on neutrality, but also called for building up a stronger military. Several Republican senators tried to restore relations between Washington and Genêt. Genêt, however, refused. Jefferson had informed him in September that they had requested his recall. Genêt figured it would be up to his replacement to mend relations. He was still in a huff, believing that members of Washington's administration had unfairly attacked his honor. In his address to Congress, Washington only reinforced this belief by telling Congress that Genêt had shown, quote, nothing of the friendly spirit of the nation which sent him. Washington also turned over to Congress all the correspondence and other documents he had regarding Genêt. Back in France, Gouverneur Morris had received the recall request in October and submitted it to the French government. Jefferson's request made clear that they still wanted good relations with France and that Genêt personally was responsible for all the problems. Since Genêt had been a Girondin appointment and the Jacobins were now in power, no one in government felt any loyalty toward Genêt. By this time, the Reign of Terror had begun in France, and any official out of favor had to fear for his life. The Jacobin government sent a new ambassador, Jean-Antoine Joseph Fauchet, to Philadelphia. It also charged Genêt with being a counter-revolutionary traitor who was involved in a criminal plot to drive the U.S. into an alliance with Britain. Fauchet arrived with a warrant for Genêt's arrest. Some sources even indicate that he had a guillotine in the hold of his ship in order to carry out the sentence immediately. When Fauchet arrived in Philadelphia in February of 1784, Genêt realized that he would not be long for this world if French officials got a hold of him. He turned to President Washington, requesting political asylum. Washington definitely wanted Genêt removed from power, but he didn't want to see him dead. His cabinet, even Hamilton, agreed with him. Washington granted the asylum and refused to turn over Genêt. In return, Genêt left politics entirely. He married Governor Clinton's daughter. Later that year, the two bought a farm on Long Island and settled down to a private life together. Later, they would move to a home in Albany. Genêt's replacement, Fauchet, revoked all French military commissions that Genêt had granted, gave an order to disarm all the privateers, and halt all plans to invade Florida, Louisiana, and Canada. Fauchet's goal was much more limited. He hoped the U.S. would continue to be a supplier of food needed for the French war effort in Europe, and pressed for these to be paid by reducing the U.S. debt to France. Fauchet also gave a guarantee that it would respect U.S. neutrality and would only purchase food in America. It would not attempt to incur British wrath by purchasing military supplies. Next week, a new invention changes the Southern economy, and James Madison gets married. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Michael Mulhern, and Gordon Kemp. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Jason Googans, and 10 Crucial Days. Go to 10crucialdays.org to learn about events related to Washington's Crossing and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. They're also working on a new musical over there called The Crossing. I actually saw a preview of this and think it's going to be great. You can also get information at the site about getting private customized tours of the area. I also want to thank Bill Tipton for his generous one-time gift via Zelle. Most of my one-time gifts come via PayPal or Venmo, but I can also accept via Zelle for those who prefer it. This week we wrapped up our discussion about the Genêt affair and of course also covered the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. These were two separate issues, but they really did become intertwined. John Adams wrote years later that the only reason Genêt was unsuccessful in beginning the military campaigns that he planned in America was the yellow fever epidemic. That's what forced people to stay home rather than enlist in his armies. It's hard to do justice with either topic in such a short episode. There are so many side stories that I had to leave out, or I really could have talked about this for weeks. Several of the armies got well underway and probably would have launched their attacks in the spring of 1794 had not the whole thing been called off over the winter. One issue that I didn't really get to focus on as much as I would have liked was Jefferson's relationship with Genêt. Jefferson had great sympathy for Genêt's plans. He gave Genêt important political advice and confided in Genêt that Washington was overly influenced by the British. Jefferson even provided a letter of introduction for Genêt's agent, André Michaux, for Governor Isaac Shelby of Kentucky. This was part of the overall effort to capture New Orleans. Jefferson certainly had sympathy for Genêt's plans, but he was also hedging his bets and not openly breaking with President Washington. When the whole plan fell apart, Jefferson tried to distance himself, of course, from everything and downplay his own role in it. It's probably hard to fathom today just how close we came to losing our democracy during this crisis. The one person who really was effective in stopping it was, once again, George Washington. When it became public that Genêt was going head-to-head against Washington on the issues, Americans who still supported and trusted their president had second thoughts about following Genêt into his war for liberty. Now, just imagine if Washington had stepped down as he planned to do after his first term in office had ended. Could President John Adams have faced down this crisis and carried the support of the people against Genêt? I very much doubt it. I also marvel at the fact that even though Genêt challenged President Washington for control of the country, that Washington was able to show forgiveness and offer him asylum in America rather than face certain death at the hands of the French. America has a long-standing reputation as an asylum for people seeking freedom from all over the world, and Washington was at the very beginning of that. The yellow fever epidemic was also an important event for the country. It involved a massive loss of life. Philadelphia was not only the capital, but was also the largest city in the country. During this epidemic, nearly 40% of the population fled the city, 20% contracted the disease, and 10% died. It not only brought the government to a halt, but also a great portion of the national economy. The actual number of people in Philadelphia who were exposed to the disease was probably much higher than the 20% that was reported, because a large number of people who are exposed to yellow fever end up showing no symptoms or only very mild ones. The 20% is based on the people who had very serious cases of yellow fever and, of course, the ones that died. We don't know for certain how the disease arrived in Philadelphia in 1793. The suspicion is that mosquitoes traveled aboard ships carrying refugees from Haiti. However it got there, it spread quickly and seemed to envelop the city. I'm surprised that it didn't spread to other regions, but it was widely contained there, and a lot of that probably has to do with the relatively limited travel that we have during that era. I mentioned Dr. Benjamin Rush playing a key role in fighting the epidemic. He actually ended up losing his sister to the fever. It would be another 100 years before medical experts figured out that mosquitoes were the cause of the disease spreading. Dr. Carlos Finlay identified mosquitoes as the problem in 1881, and his theories weren't even proven until 1900. It wasn't until the 1930s that we had an effective vaccine, and not until the 1950s that vaccine was licensed and widely available. My book recommendation this week is America's First Plague, The Deadly 1793 Epidemic That Crippled a Young Nation by Robert Watson. This is a thorough look that focuses on this horrific event. The author is a professor at Lynn University. It's a relatively new book, published in 2023. If you want to learn more about how the yellow fever impacted the country, get America's First Plague, The Deadly 1793 Epidemic That Crippled a Young Nation by Robert Watson. My online recommendation is a much older book written by Dr. Benjamin Rush, the very doctor in Philadelphia who was fighting this epidemic. In the year following the epidemic, Rush wrote down the details of what he experienced, its victims, and his attempts to save them. The book is over 350 pages and goes into extensive detail about the disease itself and his efforts at treating them. It is an amazing primary source document about the epidemic. You can get the book on archive.org, and as always, I've included direct links on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, why did General Gage allow his soldiers to be arrested and tried in a colonial civilian court after the Boston Massacre? Well, British soldiers were subject to civilian laws, just as soldiers today can be tried under civilian law. Today, the military will usually preempt a civilian trial by prosecuting a soldier in military courts. Even if that happens, though, the civilian court will eventually have the opportunity to try the soldier if a state prosecutor wishes to do so. In the case of the Boston Massacre, the British made no effort to preempt the civilian trial because they had no intention of prosecuting the soldiers themselves. In some cases, officers might have tried to prevent a civilian trial by promising a military investigation of the situation, but that would not have been effective in Boston in 1770. The locals already did not trust the military and evinced an active hostility against them. Had the military investigated and found no wrongdoing, I'm convinced the locals would have pursued a trial anyway. In the aftermath of the massacre, all British soldiers had to be removed from Boston and were stationed out on Castle Island in Boston Harbor. They would only enter town as a unit if they were ordered to do so for some mission. Individual soldiers no longer had the luxury of spending time in town when off duty. Given the politics of the situation, General Gage took a hands-off approach. Gage was in New York at the time, so he heard about these events after the fact through correspondence. Gage also wanted to write officials in London to get instructions on how they thought he should handle the situation, and of course that would take months to get a response. He did write a letter to Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson about 6 weeks after the massacre. He agreed that the government should delay the trials in order to let tempers cool down. The colonial government ended up delaying the trials for more than 6 months. The strategy of the military leadership was to allow the trials to go forward, but if soldiers were convicted and sentenced to death, they would get a stay of execution of sentence until London could decide whether to issue a reprieve. It never came down to that, since most of the soldiers were found not guilty, and the two who were found guilty of manslaughter only had their thumbs branded. Now, in 1774, 4 years after the massacre, the British Parliament passed the Administration of Justice Act, one of several acts known collectively today as the Intolerable Acts. This ordered any capital trials against government officers, including soldiers in Massachusetts, would be moved to England or to another colony for trial. But that law was not available to the soldiers in 1770, and so they were tried in a Massachusetts court. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.